Good morning, Golden Harvest, and welcome to the 2022 Agronomy in Action Research Review webinar. We have two members from our agronomy research team with us today to help kick off this webinar. We have Bruce Battles, our technical agronomy manager, and we have Brad Bernhardt, one of our research agronomists. Hoping for an interactive session, we're excited to share the content that the team has been working so hard on. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Bruce.
Good morning, everybody. Excuse me, Bruce Battles, as Julia mentioned, technical agronomy manager from Golden Harvest. We're excited to be here this morning. This is kind of the culmination of a whole year's worth of research and effort, and we're always excited at this point where we're able to start sharing that information with our customers and the farming community. Many of you are widely aware, if you look back, Golden Harvest has a deep history of delivering agronomy information to their customers. Reaching all the way back into the early 80s. A lot of you may be familiar with a program called Agronomy Upfront that was originated through Golden Harvest, which is really a program very similar to what we talk about today and now referred to as Agronomy in Action. Rooted back to the early days of the Agronomy Upfront, but more recently in the last 3 years, we've started compiling a book we're referring to as a research review. As you get access to the copies of this, you're going to notice that there are specific trials that were done in the 2021 growing season. They're spotlighted within the book this year. There's a lot of other topics that are available in there, ranging across many different things that may not only been just research topics from this year, but relevant topics that we felt brought value to you as a grower. As we look at the book, it's broken into 7 sections, so it's really usable depending on what your interest is. As you can see, the topics are really span a wide array of different areas and sections, all the way down from just general corn or soybean management, nutrient management, to even if you're a livestock producer and you want to understand better things like grain characteristics on the specific hybrid and how that might relate to feed performance. That level of information is all available in this book. This wouldn't really be possible if you didn't have a team behind the scenes working to generate the data. And that's one of the things we're very privileged within the Golden Harvest brand to have a dedicated team that can go out and do research and answer questions that you're asking yourself on your own farm, and alleviate the need for you to have to test on your own farm and do that. So as you can see on the screen here, my co-presenter today, Brad Bernhardt, is going to be joining me as well on covering helping tag team this with me today. He's located in Central Illinois, and he's our Eastern Agronomic Research Scientist. In Central Iowa, Ben Yonke is our Central Agronomy Research Scientist. And then in the West, located out in Nebraska, Andy Burkhart is our Western Agronomic Research Scientist. With trials like this, you get lots of data, and we have our own data scientist, Renee Dietzel, who helps us organize that data, analyze the data, and really start to interpret that data. And then with all that, you need somebody to really help deliver that type of information in a usable format that's easy to read and understand. And that's Dory Harris. She's our agronomic information manager. So this is the team behind the scenes that really has made this possible to bring this forward and get us to the point where we're at today. But before we ever started, we really wanted to better understand, get an understanding of what should we be doing, what type of work should we be putting in the fields, and what kind of questions should we be asking. So we started by listening, and a little over a year ago, we conducted a survey with just over 100 Midwestern corn and soybean farmers. And we asked them very specifically some questions around management practices. We wanted to understand what they felt like was the most important things that have increased our yield potential over the last 10 years, but more importantly, how's that change, or how will that change going forward in the next 10 years? And so you can see the graph on the right is a high-level summary of what we learned from those survey work when we asked specifically about corn. And they're prioritized from top to bottom based on the voting that we got back from that. And so you can see as you look through there, There are several things on the top that are deemed the most critical going forward in the next 10 years. But if you want to understand in reference to how important that was in the historically, the numbers right next to the name on each of them represent the relative ranking when asked about the previous 10 years. So it allows you to understand how much has this really changed historically and going forward. And really what we saw in here is that fertility matters a lot. Obviously, even before the fertilizer prices started changing as much as they have recently, even a year ago before that, right, the fertility was top of mind from a grower's perspective. And areas of improving fertilizer placement, understanding secondary micronutrient applications and how that works and the value it might bring, and in-season fertility, such as side dressing nitrogen or other things such as sulfur. Those are all three of the top four categories from a prioritization standpoint. But a couple of categories that historically may have not been topping out as top priorities, but are quickly rising, we notice from this, is understanding the role of a foliar fungicide, as well as a lot of new biologicals in the marketplace, and what's their role at increasing yield potential going forward. When we look at soybeans, it was a little different, our learning in that. Fertility was much less of a driver, and most of the things that we felt were critical to management practices and increasing yield potential historically still carry through going forward in the future from what our survey participants told us. And that would be things such as seed treatment, foliar fungicides, planting, increasing the precision on planting, and continued planting early, even though that's dropped in relative ranking over the last couple of years. So this really gave us a feel for what you felt was important, and really directed us around what we actually went out and created protocols and executed in the field for trials, and at the end of the day drove what went into the research review for this year. One last question we asked when we were conducting the survey that we thought was probably the biggest learning at all for us was we asked specifically around how important it was to customize your management practices down to a specific hybrid or variety level. And unanimously, almost over 84% of the participants felt that was extremely critical. But when we asked the next question around how many people are actually doing that and implementing a plan at a hybrid specific level, roughly half of those people are actually doing that. And we, our interpretation of this is that it's probably due to not having access to good information at your fingertips that allow you to implement a game plan or create a good game plan at that type of level. And that's a large part of what we want to continue to support and provide in our Agronomy In Action Research is help design and create implementable game plans based on knowledge and prevent you having to spend time in the field researching things on your own. And by the time you understand, how things work on your own farm, that hybrid may be obsolete at that point in time. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve, and upon commercialization of products, have a implementable information that can help drive programs going forward. As some examples of different types of trials that we're not going to cover today, but you'll see once you have a copy of the book, the topics really did range. Just some visual examples from 4 different trials we had. We conducted trials looking at things like phantom yield loss, understanding what that is, and is it real or what's happening there. We had studies looking at soybean planting dates, but within that, we wanted to understand what the role of changing maturities as well as changing seeding rates, how all that interacts when we look at soybean planting date responses. We had a first year trial looking at cover crops with the growing interest in cover crops. We want to understand if there were hybrid differences in how they respond if you're planting green into that, which we know can be maybe a less than ideal management strategy versus an earlier termination date. We want to understand how hybrids respond when managed that way, and if there's ones that maybe we should try to avoid that management practice with. And then lastly, you can see a general type of study there at the bottom that we really wanted to look at and illustrate the value of photosynthesis within the plant and how the location, upper canopy versus lower canopy, and understand what the contribution each of those leaves provide, and really ties back to a lot of other things, such as the value of a fungicide or what damage we could expect from a hailstorm can really be extrapolated from the information found in that. So those are just a few examples of things we're not going to spend any time on today, but you'll find in the book. And with today, we really want to be focusing a lot back. If you think back to the results of the survey work, fertility really mattered in the results that we saw. And so today's topic is really going to center around fertility management. So Brad, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about a genetic by environment by management trial that we conducted this year. We know that G by E by M interaction is important to achieving high yields. I'm kind of really going to focus on the management aspect of that and how hybrids respond differently to those management systems. So the genetic component here is we had two different groups of hybrids, a short season hybrid set ranging from 102 to 108 day hybrid. And in that graph on the right there, those hybrids were planted at those orange dot locations, one in South Dakota and one in northern Iowa. The full season hybrid set ranging from 110 day to 115 day hybrid. Those were planted at 6 locations. Those are the blue dots, one in Nebraska, Kansas, 2 in Iowa, and 2 in Illinois. So the 3 management systems that we were focusing on in this trial was a farmer standard fertility practice, which is whatever the farmer's normal fertility system was for each given location. And then there was no fungicide applied to that. For the early season management system, we added that on top of whatever the farmer standard was. So it was a pretty aggressive rate of planter applied fertilizer. So we had 5 gallons of 624-6 applied in furrow. We also had a combination of UAN and ATS blend that we dribbled on the soil surface about 3 inches on each side of the row. We also had a 2x2x2 placement of Nature's triple option applied at 15 gallons per acre. That was really heavily focused on the P and K fertility, applying 20 to 30 pounds of P and K with that product. So that third management system is we took that same early system and we added a late season management on top of that. And that late season management, or you can call it an in-season management, we added a sidedress application of 60 pounds of UAN at the V6 growth stage. And then we ended that with a fungicide using Mirvis Neo at R1. Both were planted, all these systems were planted at both 34 and 44,000 plants per acre. So these really aren't recommendations per se. That's pretty aggressive planting rate and also pretty aggressive fertilizer system there. But we really wanted to see the difference between these hybrids and how they respond to these management systems. So here's a closer look at that early season management system and the rate of nutrients that we're applying there. It's color coded on where the placement was. So the orange was in furrow, the blue would be the surface dribble application, and the 2x2x2 placement is green. And you can see in total, we were applying 70 pounds of nitrogen, 36 pounds of phosphorus, 32 pounds of potassium, 17 pounds of sulfur, and a little bit of zinc, all applied with the planter. We did this with our research planter. As you can see there on the top right, there's some tanks hanging off the side of that planter. And with those tanks, we can apply all these different nutrients and these different placements all at the same timing, going across the field in the same pass. The 2x2x2 placement, we're using 360 bandits. That was the the manufacturer that we're using there. There's a lot of different manufacturers of 2x2x2 placement. We really settled on that one because it was the easiest one to modify in order to fit a Manageme row unit there. So we really were focusing on this precision fertilizer placement, placing those nutrients right in the root zone. And the reason we're really focused on that is because if you look here, these are two root systems. The one on the left is planted at 32,000 plants per acre. And you can see that really the horizontal spread of a root system is only about 6 to 8 inches. So broadcasting fertilizer on the soil surface probably isn't the most effective method. It becomes even more important if you look at that root on the right there. That root was planted at 44,000 plants per acre. So as you increase your seeding rate, the size of your root system gets significantly smaller, and that's where this precision fertilizer placement becomes even more important. So that was the early season management systems. Here's how we implemented the late or in-season management applications. So that side dress application of nitrogen was made with a backpack, and we walk down the rows and physically apply that UAN solution right along the crop row there, and you can see on that bottom left photo. For the R1 fungicide application, we actually use a drone with RTK guidance to make the foliar fungicide application. And really the take-home message of this slide is that the Agronomy Research Group, we utilize a large range of technologies, all the way from applying nitrogen by walking it on to applying it with an RTK guided drone. And I'm sure you can imagine, as a research agronomist, which application method would be our favorite. So this is what the visual responses look like. This is at our Geneseo location. It was our most responsive location. And what you're looking at here is those green strips is where the precision fertilizer placement or planter applied fertilizer was applied compared to where it was not applied. Very, very visual in not only color, but also growth there. Actually, the cooperator that we were working with on this farm, he lives up at that farmstead at the top of the screen there, and he would drive by this field every day when coming out of his driveway. And one day I was out in the field taking some measurements, and he stopped by and he said, "I don't care what hybrid that is. I want to plant 100% of my acres using that hybrid." Well, unfortunately, I had to tell him that it's not just one hybrid there. It's actually multiple hybrids in that green strip. And what he was really looking at was a management system and actually fertilizer. In particular, a lot of that is what you're seeing is the sulfur response. You can see a lot of that is a little bit of yellowing going on around there. And actually in this part of Western Illinois and even a lot in Eastern Iowa, there's a lot of yellow corn early on, some striping, and a lot of little sulfur deficiency. And you can see that quite a bit in the next photo. So here's a little closer image. On the left there was early on. You can see that yellow striping. That would be some sulfur deficiency. And then on the right there, when we applied that planter, applied fertility, much greener, a little bit of growth enhancement as well. And even later on in the season, through the middle of June, a lot of that yellow striping went away, but the extreme growth enhancement was still there from that intensive fertilizer placement. So here's the results. This is average across all the hybrids and how these different locations responded to the different management systems. So look at those bars on the right there. That's the when we average across all the locations. You can see that we had a nice yield response to the precision fertilizer placement or that early season management, about 13 bushels per acre. And then when we added that late season management or that side dress nitrogen plus fungicide on top of the early season management, we gained an additional 6 bushels per acre. The other thing you'll notice is that the response really varied by location. So if you look at that Geneseo, Illinois location, those pictures I just showed, that was actually over a 40 bushel per acre response. So that was our most responsive location. Also Slater, Iowa, that had a very high, was very responsive site as well, over 25 bushels per acre response to the early season management system. Clinton, Illinois, that was the one location that was most responsive to the in-season nitrogen and fungicide application at a 13 bushel per acre increase there. And then that last location I want to point out is the Beaver Crossing, Nebraska location. You can see that was the one location where we really didn't see any response at all. A lot of that is because even in the standard management system and what the farmer was already doing, he was getting 285 bushels. So it was already very intensive managed with not only fertilizer, but also there's irrigation at that location as well. So this table here, again, is averaged across all the hybrids, and it is looking at the response to population and management system. So if you look there in a standard management system at the two different populations, statistically, there was no yield difference. Similarly, at the early season management system, statistically, there was no yield difference between those two populations. Actually, usually we would actually see a yield decrease when we bump up the population from 34,000 to 44,000. Because it's just too many plants in a standard management system. Here, with some good growing conditions, we actually didn't see any yield difference, but usually we would see a yield decrease in that situation. But it's not until you have the full management system, so really intensive fertility early, and then finishing off that plant late in the season with the early plus late management, where you see that yield increase with the higher population of about 8 bushels per acre. And in that situation, when you highly manage your crop, well, then population may become the limiting factor. So basically everything I've shown so far is really looks at the average across all the hybrids. So now we're going to start digging into the individual hybrid responses. So these pictures here were taken at the Slater, Iowa location this year. So those are the 5 hybrids we were looking at. And you can see the difference in the early season growth when looking at the standard management system compared to the early season management system, or that planter applied fertilizer. So you can see that G10D21 had an extremely increase in growth there, and also that 15J91. Those are the 2 most responsive hybrids in this group. And then that G10L16 and G12S75 didn't respond as greatly. There was some response there, but just not as great to that early season fertility. So you can see that there's some differences going on there just looking at the visual images. So here's a little bit later on in the season. This is at Geneseo, and we can still see some of these differences going on. So here's some photos. If you look at that standard column at 34 versus 44,000 plants per acre, you can see when we bumped up that population to 44,000 plants per acre in a standard management system, and you get a wind event in August, we had some lodging with this hybrid. But if you put that same 44,000 plants out there and you fertilize it early with precision fertilizer placement, it mitigated a lot of that lodging, almost when all of it was taken away. Also, if you look at this top middle image here, you can see that there's some northern corn leaf blight and then this early management system. But when you apply that fungicide later on in the season, it actually controls a lot of that disease pressure. So here's another hybrid. This is 15J91. Similar story when looking at that wind event at that higher population in a standard management system. We had some lodging, but when you had fertilizer precisely placed so that immediately available to the plant, made a more robust plants, was able to handle that wind event with that early season management. So I want to focus on these bottom 2 right photos here. At the high population, between the difference between the early management and the early plus late season management. You can see in just the early management, there's quite a bit of firing going on at the lower canopy, some nitrogen deficiency going on. But that image on the right, when we added that additional 60 pounds of nitrogen side dress, you can see that lower canopy really greened up for this hybrid. So this hybrid likes side dress nitrogen. So here's some yield results. This is averaged across all the locations for each individual hybrid. And this is looking at just the response to population. And not surprisingly, these hybrids differed in their responsiveness the responsiveness to increased population. So if you look at that short season hybrid set there, that G02K39 was the most responsive hybrid to population, increasing yield by 7 bushels per acre. But many of the hybrids had little or no, or even sometimes responded negatively to the higher populations, which again is not surprising with how aggressive that rate is. If you look at the full season set, that G10D21 was the most responsive hybrid to the increased seeding rate. And that hybrid consistently responds to seeding rate across all of our seeding rate trials as well. It's a very responsive hybrid to population. That G13P84 was another one that had good response to population. And then that G15J91 is one hybrid that does not need population to maximize grain yield. So now we'll look at the responsiveness to the different management systems between these different hybrids. So there's a couple ones I want to point out here. So in that early season hybrid set, that O2K39 had a nice response to the early season management, increasing yield by 5 bushels per acre, and then increased yield by an additional 7 bushels per acre when you added that late season management on top of it. And that was a very similar story for that 07G73, good response to both early and late season management of 8 bushels per acre each. But if you look at that OAR52, that hybrid was the most responsive to the early season management, but only minimal response when adding that side dress and fungicide application. So one way to utilize this data is if a grower always side dress nitrogen across all of his acres, but due to weather issues or it being too wet to be in the field and the side dress is starting to get delayed, I'd focus those nitrogen or side dress applications on that 07G73 or the O2K39, those hybrids first, because they have a greater response to that nitrogen application before making an application to that OAR52. So if we look at the full season set, that 10D21, very, very responsive to early season management. And that's similar to that photo that I showed, that early season growth enhancement. That hybrid really needs that precision fertilizer placement to set a high yield potential. And then you compare that to that 10L16, pretty much a pretty marginal response compared to the rest of those hybrids early season management. But when you look at those photos, it may not respond in terms of yield, but it definitely responds in terms of agronomics and improves the standability of that hybrid when there's a wind event. So the last hybrid I want to point out is this 15J91. That was the most responsive hybrid to early season management. Again, trying to set a high yield potential for that hybrid. And then when we add that late season management, also very responsive to that nitrogen and fungicide application. And those photos showed that. So one thing to look at here is if there's a grower who applies broadcast fall fertilizer and one shot of anhydrous in the fall, and that's his fertility program, and doesn't apply a fungicide. If you look at the standard management yields here, 15J91 may not be the hybrid for that grower because it's just not going to have the yield potential without additional management. But if there's a grower that has precision fertilizer placement, applies a fungicide, side dress, and really manages his crop, well, if you look at these yields on the right column here, 15J91 is a great option for that grower. It's a full season hybrid, and the more you manage and feed that plant, the more yield potential it has. So just to wrap this up with some key takeaways, setting a high yield potential with precision fertilizer placement, and then maintaining that yield potential through grain fill with plant health and fungicide and side dress nitrogen is really the key to achieving high yields. And the second point there is that hybrids should be selected based on management style, as I kind of just pointed out. In some situations, some hybrids just aren't meant for some growers. Or the management style should be adjusted to fit the hybrid. For example, when looking at that 07G73 compared to the OAR52, which hybrid should be focused should a side dress application be focused on more? And that last point there is just this intensified management not only increases grain yield, but also improves hybrid agronomics. In particular, that 10L16 really had improved agronomics with this intensive management system. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce, and he's going to talk a little bit more about, dive a little bit deeper into just the sulfur component.
So thanks for that, Brad, and going through that's really good examples of how different hybrids can really respond to different management practices and styles. And really, as you pointed out, that it can really drive into some decision-making process, especially it could be around hybrid selection, then gearing hybrid selection really for your own management practices, or understanding in certain situations such as rescue treatments around nitrogen, as you pointed out. There may be hybrids that if you can't get across every acre and every field, there may be hybrids you want to really focus in on and ensure you're going to get the most value from if you can get across those fields first. So really good information across the slide there too. We're going to switch gears now and talk about another topic that would be sulfur. So when we think about sulfur, this has become more and more talked about here more recently, and largely because sulfur deficiency is becoming much more common across the U.S. for a couple of reasons. So as yields have increased throughout the years, we're really increasing the removal rates of sulfur from the soil. But probably more importantly, and why we're seeing this become such more of an issue, is historically, we're really dependent on atmospheric deposition. So sulfur deposits from the atmosphere. And as we've cleaned up a lot of our industrial smokestacks and even our emission standards on a lot of things, we've really dramatically reduced the amount of sulfur that's naturally occurring from atmospheric deposition. And that's just an example you can see in the map there of, back in 2001, the kind of the Iron Belt or the Eastern Corn Belt there was a huge deposits that were annually dependent upon. And in 2015, more recently, that's really changed. So it really has driven how we need to think about this particular nutrient differently going forward. And to add upon that, as we all continue to plant earlier, what we indirectly are doing by planting earlier is we're planting into cooler soil conditions. And as we'll talk about shortly, those cooler soil conditions can start to impact sulfur availability as well. There's a lot of things beyond just the temperature and that can impact sulfur availability. 95% of our sulfur actually is mineralized from soil organic matter. So you're starting your baseline organic matters of a soil alone can really impact availability of sulfur to the crop, because it's so dependent on it and the mineralization of sulfate to make it plant available. Mineralization rates also, as we talked about in the example with early planting, they're very dependent on a couple of factors. One, temperature, but also besides temperature is moisture. So cooler soils, drier soils are all going to delay or slow down mineralization rates in the spring, and can, even though we have a pool of organic matter that can eventually be mineralized into sulfur that'll be available to plant, it may be delayed and causing short periods of stress early on. Lots of other factors of supplemental sources of sulfur that can come into play. Fields with a history of manure applications are really good at mineralizing and making available more sulfur. Along with that, irrigated fields in some areas, there can be a significant amount of sulfur delivered through irrigation water. So maybe indirectly providing sulfur to fields, and we didn't even know it in a lot of cases. But likewise, sulfate or sulfur, the sulfate form of sulfur behaves very similarly to nitrogen in a lot of ways. Even the symptomology that we see of the yellowing of the plant is very, very similar, although slightly nuances. It's going to show up more in the new growth and development of it due to the mobility of that nutrient within the plant. So there are subtle differences, but again, it behaves very similar to nitrogen. And one of those ways it behaves really similar to nitrogen is when in the sulfate form, similar to nitrogen in the nitrate form, it's a moves more freely in the soil, especially as water is available in soil. And so it's going to be more subject to leaching and losing a certain amount of nitrate or sulfate out when they're in that plant available form, but are more susceptible to that. One of the biggest challenges I see as a grower is trying to predict when you're going to get an economic response from sulfur. Traditionally, we would think of nutrient, we'd use soil testing as a way to quantify what's there in the soil and then go out and apply based on that soil test. Soil tests have been fairly limited in certain situations, again, back to the organic matter and the availability of this through organic matter and the mineralization that comes through that. So sandier or low organic matter soils have been fairly good at it's fairly easy to use a soil test to predict what the outcome will be in those types of soils, but can be a little inconsistent on higher organic matter soils and using that method to understand if you'll get a response from sulfur or not. Tissue sampling, on the other hand, is in certain states been calibrated pretty well and can help us understand where that deficiency is showing up at. But the challenge there with tissue sampling a lot of times is that you're doing it at a time frame that may be getting later in the season and less likely to drive an in-season response, depending on the time of sampling of the occur and the ability to apply and move that nutrient down into the root zone and get it into a sulfate form that's plant available. So no exact great answers as far as how to predict when it is, other than when we have low organic matter soils that we know are testing low in sulfur. We did trials this year in 2021 on both corn and soybeans. We had 9 locations. You can see from the map where those were located across to Iowa, Illinois, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And at each of those sites, we had a slightly different protocol for the corn and the soys, but a lot of similarities to it. We tried to compare sulfur applications to no sulfur applications in general. And we used a standard rate of 20 pounds of sulfur per acre on both the corn and soybean trials. For our purposes, since we were applying in the spring, we used ammonium thiosulfate, which is a liquid form of sulfur. It was easy to handle. It may be one of the more expensive forms of sulfur to be able to deliver, but for our purposes, we were able to apply it to specific treatments in the field and turn it on and off. And so it was really a good model of what that response would be. Within the corn trials, we took it a little bit step further and tried to understand more within the design of the trial to understand the response based on the timing of application. So we wanted to understand if you were more of a standard lay-by or side dressing application timing versus a pre-plant or even at planting type of timing, what those differences in response may be. And so we'll see some of the results from that. In both of these scenarios, we know the ammonium thiosulfate provides a small amount of nitrogen on its own. So even in the soybean trials, we added an additional 9 pounds per acre through a UAN just to try to take out any bias that nitrogen may have and applied that to the no sulfur treatments. So we consistently had a same nitrogen rate in both our corn and soybean trials where we did not have sulfur applied. And so so we felt like we had a really good design to understand what that actual sulfur response was. Here's just an example from one of our locations. This happens to be our Geneseo, Illinois site that Brad mentioned earlier. And it was the most visual of sites there for sulfur deficiency. We saw, as Brad pointed out, we had a very large response in his trial that he talked about. And again, a large portion of that response was due to the sulfur, making sulfur available to the crop. In this example, you can see 2 different hybrids that we tested in the same field. And you can see the differences in color. At the lower right corner of the screen, you can see the G10L16, where it was applied at planting, as compared to the V6 timeframe that had not yet gone on at the time this picture was taken, and the yellowing and the stress that the crop had underwent for several weeks prior to getting to that V6 timing before the applications was made. So when we look at the results from this year, we did not see a consistent response across all the locations we had, and you can see that in the map on the left. The response is broken down by individual locations, which was not that unexpected. There's a lot of reasons to explain why we got the responses at the location that we did and why we didn't at the other locations. We had the Geneseo, Illinois site, and the green dot to the right there, you can see was our largest response. We ranged from 20 to 38 bushels, depending on the time of application and the hybrid there. But and we had very visual symptomology, as you can see on the right out of the bat, right as soon as the crop emerged out of the ground. Contrasting to that, the Slater, Iowa, the central Iowa location that represented the green dot there, we saw a really nice response of 16 to 17 bushels, but we never really saw any visual response. So early season, there was very little stress that crop had actually sufficient levels of sulfur probably to meet the needs at a young growth stage. And the benefits that came there were more for late season availability of sulfur going into grain filling stages. Some of the other locations that, as we look at there, that actually the Kansas location, for example, had lower organic matter, and is typically a site that we would have, based on the soil test being less than 15 parts per million, would have anticipated a response there. However, both Kansas and Nebraska locations were irrigated. And as we pointed out earlier, we know we can get a sufficient, actually significant levels of sulfur delivered through irrigation water. And we speculate that the reasons for no response at those particular locations was due to sulfur being delivered in other means, such as irrigation. Some of the other locations that were non-responsive after the fact were, when we started looking at them and examining them, they were either had a history of manure applications or were generally high in organic matter content, and really kind of start explaining why we didn't see a response at every location consistently across the board. When we look closer at some of these responsive sites, though, and the graph on the right, you can see the example of both the two hybrids we had in this trial, 10D21 and G10L16 at Geneseo, Illinois. The things that stand out is we got a really significant response from both time of applications and both hybrids, but the response was actually bigger in when we look at the at planting, or the blue bars on the graph, as compared to a delayed application of V5 and V6. And I think that hindsight's 20/20 every time, but when you look back on that, it kind of starts to make sense. If we go back to that field at Geneseo, you can see the picture on the left at early on, that 3-leaf stage before the post applications was made. That plant was going under significant stress at that time frame, and really hungry for sulfur at that time. And all the way on the picture on the right before we were about to do our side dress applications, there's a significant amount of stress that plant's still undergoing before we ever made those lay-by applications occur. And also a lot of yield potential is being determined, kernel counts and number of rows around this V5 to V6 timeframe. So really makes sense as to why we saw a very big difference in time of application, preference for the early application, that situation at Geneseo. When we go back and look at Slater, Iowa, the location where we didn't really see visual symptomology of deficiencies in there, we saw a response to sulfur applications, but between the application timing, it really didn't matter which time you did. It was more about supplying the needed sulfur for later in the growing season, and there were sufficient amounts being mineralized for that early season growth and development to keep the plant out and not under stress. We also looked at sulfur in soybean trials, and so soybeans typically thought of as kind of secondly around sulfur management and a little less known to be a little more less consistent on sulfur responses. So we were excited to go to these same locations and look and see if we had a sulfur response. We looked at 4 varieties within each of those locations. You can see it laid out in the image here. And you can see within each of the reps there how from left to right as we move across the screen, it's really easy to pick out the no sulfur strips going through there due to the color, the pale yellow color of the crop, and the slower canopy development of the crop in there. So this was our most responsive site at Geneseo, Illinois again. And so let's look closer at what the yield outcome was from those. And similarly to corn, we didn't get a consistent response across all locations, and which we didn't expect to either, right? Based on knowing the background of some of those fields, as we talked about. But we did see some interesting things. The Geneseo location obviously was our biggest responder at 16 bushels. So, having that sulfur available early in the growing season was critical there. And we continued to see a response at Slater, but although a much, much smaller response than we saw in corn. When we averaged those across all the locations where we had a common set of varieties, so you can see on the right, the roughly 5 locations averaged together across those 4 varieties, we started to see a little bit of differences in trends on varieties and how they each respond. So the 2 varieties on the left, the GH2722s and the GH2788s, were definitely much more responsive in our trials in this example to sulfur applications at those locations. And although slight responses on the other 2, it was much less. When we go back out and look at some of the locations that didn't respond, that I think we touched a little bit on before, it made sense. But one thing that really stood out is, if you remember on the Kansas location, again, a lower organic matter soil that we anticipated would have responded to sulfur in corn, but didn't, likely due to the irrigation. Actually got a really nice response here with sulfur on soybeans. And we contribute this largely due to the fact that the irrigation management was much different on the corn acres versus the soybean acres. Fewer trips around the field and a lot less water put on in general, which reduced the amount of sulfur coming through in a form of irrigation. And we contribute that to why we saw a larger response of soybeans there, but didn't see that in corn. So some interesting results as we go through. But to close out, there's one important element that I think with soybeans that we also need to keep in mind, and that is the seed composition. Protein and oil content can be quite valuable in certain markets and certain areas. And as growers, a lot of our soybean growing associations are really striving for increasing protein content. And so we wanted to understand what the response to sulfur was on that. We know sulfur plays a role in amino acids and protein levels and development within a plant. And when we looked at all of our locations, we had 4 locations out of all 9 where we saw a spike in sulfur content in the grain coming off of those fields. We looked closer at those 4 individual locations, which you can see on the graphs on the right. We started by looking at the protein content and trying to understand if that protein content actually changed at any of these locations. And 3 of the 4 locations, we actually got a significant response or increase in protein levels due to applications of the ammonium thiosulfate at time of planting. We also know that there's a give and take relationship between protein and oil often recognized. And we saw that same relationship here at 2 of those 4 locations. So the 2 locations that had the largest increase in protein levels also saw a significant decrease in oil content. And so as a consequence of being able to create more protein, we gave up space or real estate within the seed, and that was given up through the form of oil, what normally would have produced oil. One of the big questions that's probably weighing a lot of people's mind is how do you access a copy of the research review? As a participant in this webinar, you should be automatically, as long as information was provided at a time of registration, should be provided a complimentary copy for joining us today. If you have friends or anybody as well, or if you just prefer a digital copy, there should be a digital copy available. If you go onto goldenharvestseeds.com, download a complete digital copy as well. With that, we'll jump straight into the questions that have come up. I think there may be a few questions that you have for us.
There are. There's one that's a little more specific, so we'll start off with that. We have a question that says, I noticed 2722s and 2788s have a larger response to sulfur application over the 2872s and the 3088s. Knowing the genetic background here of the first two and that they're similar, how much does that play, if any, in the response to sulfur? I'm assuming that'd be a good question for you, Bruce.
Yeah. So yeah, there may very well be, due to background pedigrees going in there. It sounds like the question whoever asked was looking at kind of the understanding of how repeatable that might be based on the pedigree and background. And due to the limited number of varieties we have in this, it's kind of hard to extrapolate that probably out of here. But again, it's very likely that the background parents are probably part of what's driving this. And I think we do have a limited number of locations. I think to draw, to understand how consistent that response is, we'd have to do more trials. But I think it goes into how deficient is an individual location. If you're the Geneseo location, for example, that we looked at, was really responsive. I think those are the type of locations I would expect to see maybe more differences in sulfur response by variety. Whereas, if you're getting an extra bushel or two kind of thing, more like our Slater location, those are going to be less variety driven and just more general, the need for that. So more, at the end of the day, I think we need more information before we could characterize our entire lineup for this type of response.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. One more question around sulfur. There was a question about symptomology when it comes to striping, and if that is always sulfur deficiency, or maybe you could expand on what other symptomology might be occurring there.
Yeah, good question. There, in general, the pale yellow color can be a little misleading, right? The couple of you think about nitrogen deficiency early on could be very similar. How sulfur versus nitrogen is the mobility in the plant really drives the difference. So you think about nitrogen deficiencies, you usually see that on the older leaves, so the lower first leaves that come out. Whereas sulfur deficiencies is always going to be expressed in the new growth. So that's a key way to kind of, if you're wondering, is this nitrogen or is this sulfur, look at where the symptomology is being expressed. And is it in the new growth coming out of the whorl, or is it down on those lower leaves and the older leaves? And if it's the new growth, it's most likely the pale yellowing is from sulfur. The striping can be confused with other things as well. So probably the biggest thing that comes to mind is it could be mimic a herbicide carryover from a soybean chemistry that go in there. It is pretty uncommon to see the herbicide carryover. So I'd say the odds of, if you're trying to determine what it is, it's probably more likely a striping driven by sulfur content versus the herbicide carryover. But that would be something to look at, as look back in the field history and understand what the application history is from that. And the other key thing on delineating the difference between those is herbicide carryover type of things are usually distinguished with patterns in the field that might like replicate a overlap area. So you might see triangles and headlands or something like that. And so that's another key way to try to distinguish, is this a herbicide carryover is a soil deficiency that might be more random and less linear kind of breaks within a field.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate that. We had a question come in later on, and so I'm going to direct it your way, Brad. What do you consider high organic matter compared to low organic matter soils? It was in the chat.
Yeah, so that that probably relates to some of the fertility trials that we were doing. We have a large range in the organic matter that we're working with between these different locations, as you can imagine. So our range at that Geneseo location, for example, was our lowest organic matter site, and it was about 1 to 1.5% organic matter. Most of our locations are in the 2.5 to 4 organic matter, and that's pretty typical or average organic matter. And we did have a couple above 4 and even one at 5% organic matter. So those are pretty high organic matter locations.
Thank you. And our last question that was in the Q&A box for today can be directed at both of you if you'd both like to answer it. Is what are we doing for individuals that fall outside of the range of the significant market share that we hold here at Golden Harvest? So this one is talking more of those 80-day and 94-day hybrids up north of South Dakota. So what are we doing outside of the kind of key corn belt in terms of our research?
Good question. So yeah, so as pointed out, we're really focused on a lot of our locations are in more core, the I-80 corridor, for example, across the Illinois and Iowa and some of those states. And our vision longer term is to expand our research program out and grow. And we're doing a little bit of that this year as well. So we're moving into some southern. We'll have a site established in southern Minnesota. And we'll have a site established in southern Wisconsin that will start to try to see more of the earlier season hybrids through next year in some of these trials. And then eventually, in the long term, we'd hope to establish a more permanent site even farther north as we gain capabilities and are able to do that. But that's our plan of attack, I guess you might say, for that. And we realize that gap that's there, and we're trying to work through that. And we'd love to go a lot of different directions, east, west, and north, and expand our research program. But we're starting and building out right now.
Thank you, Bruce. One last one that was just quickly added is, will you have any more studies that surround cover crop trials moving forward?
Yeah, so we do have another cover crop trial plan for this year. We established a cover crop at a couple of locations last fall, and we're gonna take a little bit different spin on the trial this year. We'll still have a hybrid, looking at hybrid response type of element, but we're gonna take our learnings from last year and focus the number of hybrids down into a smaller group and try to incorporate in some general management type of questions, like, what's the impact of termination timing, and what's the role of nitrogen management within a cover crop system, and try to help build out a few more of those management details next year for audience.
Great, thank you. Any last minute thoughts, Bruce or Brad, or questions that you have? Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap today's session.
No, just appreciate everybody attending. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for your time and today, and we hope everybody enjoys and finds value in the copy. We always welcome the feedback, and we are always doing our best at listening. So thanks for your time again today.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Brad, and thank you everyone that has attended this morning.